Good afternoon. Let me welcome you to our August 11th Sunday School class. Today we're continuing this series of people serving alongside others. You recall, and again, this week we're talking about David, but last week we talked about David and his relationship with Saul. Today is a very different relationship. It's David and his relationship with Jonathan. Now, if you recall, Saul was quite a bit older than David. It'd be kind of like a boss and an employer, or either a parent and child. That type of difference in their ages. So a very different type, and as we saw, it was a very stressed relationship that Saul kept going in these cycles. He would love David, and then he would try to kill him, and just kind of back and forth in that relationship. Jonathan is a very different type of relationship with David. He's probably more like a sibling or somebody that's a co-worker, somebody about the same age. To me, it's always as I've studied David and Jonathan, it's just a beautiful relationship. I think of them as very close. I think one writer referred to them as soul brothers. They were joined. They became very one in the spirit, and I think one of the scriptures will refer to it. They were very close, and it's not very often we get that type of friendship, that type of a relationship. And if you have that with a person, cherish it. I thought as I was studying this, I thought of myself and my next older brother, who was just a couple years older than me. We had a very special relationship. We could be miles apart and come back together, and we were just instantly just pick up where we were. And he passed away a couple years ago, and I still dearly miss him. I don't have that person there that I can call about anything. So I think this is kind of a picture of what we see with David and Jonathan. The point of our lesson today is don't let cultural expectations define your role. Now, we know that Jonathan was a son of Saul, and his expectations, certainly the cultural expectation, was for him to become king, and certainly Saul expected that. And that threw certain expectations on Jonathan, which could have led to a great stress relationship between him and David. But we'll see this is very different than what actually occurred. Jonathan is Saul's oldest son. I think it's over in chapter 14. It names Saul's family. He had 3 sons and 2 daughters. And it's kind of interesting if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 14. I won't try to read their names because a couple of them are hard to pronounce. But the last verse in that chapter 14, it says, all the days of Saul was bitter war with Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty and brave man, he took him into service. Well, that kind of set the stage with David coming in, as we talked about last week, that David was a mighty man, a brave man, brave young man, and Saul took him into his service. Well, today's lesson will be jumping, and I'm going to try to kind of summarize several chapters here, because we're going to be hitting, and the first part is chapter 18, the first 4 verses, chapter 18, is kind of within the chapter 18 that we studied last week. But it's the first time we're introduced to Jonathan and David, their relationship. And then we'll go over to chapter 19 and see where Jonathan intercedes. David and Saul is having a conflict. Jonathan intercedes. Then finally we'll look at chapter 23 again, and this is probably the last time that David and Jonathan were actually physically together. So we're going to see kind of some different episodes within their relationship. So let's look here in chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. And this is where we'll start seeing these role expectations that were probably existed for Jonathan. verse 1, it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, and this is going, if you go back to chapter 17, this is right after David had killed Goliath, and Saul is talks to him after that instance. It says, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in the spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. Now that's a very interesting. I love the terminology that they became one in the spirit. I think Holman. Let me see what it says that they had a close friendship. I don't think that's near as strong as saying that they were one in the spirit. They thought alike. I think they bonded and had such a close friendship. And it says that Jonathan loved him as himself. That's as close as you can get. Now, there's some commentators, ones I would never read. Some people have suggested that David and Jonathan may have even it went beyond normal type of relationship of two men. And that I don't see there's any evidence of that. I just think this is that very close brotherly friendship that they had. And if you look over in some of David's Psalms, he very, very strongly speaks out against homosexuality. So I don't think, I almost think you hate to mention it, but some commentators will suggest that. But this idea that they become one in the spirits, what a beautiful idea of them being together. And verse 2 is, from that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home. Now, again, you remember back before the Goliath incident, Saul was having these mental issues, and somebody suggested that they bring David there, that David played a harp or music, and that David could come and kind of soothe times that when this evil spirit was coming on him. So, but after this incident, after this time here, after the Goliath incident, that Saul kept David with him, did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan, verse 3, and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. This is this beautiful relationship that they became one in the spirit. In verse 4, we see that a demonstration of the commitment of this friendship that Jonathan made. He gave David his robe along with his tunic. A tunic would have been, some translations call it armor, or kind of a military tunic would be kind of a jacket. His sword, his bow, and his belt. These are marks of the official prince of Israel. So Jonathan, and I think he knew what he's doing. He's putting these onto David. He sees him rather than, he's already perhaps seeing him as the line of David that will provide the Messiah. He's a wonderful example of an unselfish friend. You would have, Jonathan had nothing to gain from this friendship. And I like on page 107, it says that, let me see if I can find it. Page 10, make sure. Okay, here at the top of page 107. Jonathan wasn't, I love this, Jonathan wasn't concerned about politics of the day, but the purpose of God was being carried out. Jonathan wasn't concerned about the optics of how others would receive their friendship. As I read that, it really jumped out. As so much of things today are concerned about the politics of, what's going on behind the scenes and how to promote individuals, are the optics. And I think it's very noteworthy that Jonathan wasn't concerned. The politics was that he was undermining himself to become king. The optics was that perhaps he was even going against his father. And he was not, this bond, his friendship with David was so strong, he wasn't concerned about the politics or the optics of what, but that's that beautiful, deep bond between two brothers. Well, in the rest of chapter 18 is what we covered last week. You recall this is where David goes out and David and Saul starts this relationship. Chapter 17 is David and Goliath. Chapter 18 is where this, after that, some battles that women came back, or people would start saying Saul has slain his thousands and David is his 10,000. So this jealousy developed between the two, or not between the two, but on the basis of Saul relative to David. Let me read verse 30, the last verse of chapter 18. It says, the Philistine commanders continued to go to battle, and as officers did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. So, David continued, God was with him. You recall back in, I think it's chapter 16, verse 13 is where it talks about the Samuel went out and the Spirit of the Lord, chapter 13, so this was after Samuel anointed David, and so Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. And that's the evidence of that power of God, the presence of God was with David as he went into battle after battle, and he continued to be successful. And the rest of the army, the rest of the officers saw this. I don't think they were really jealous of David. They were just happy that he was through his leadership, that they were being successful. So his name became well known. Now we pick back up in chapter 14 with our second set of verses, and it says, Saul told his son, and some translations use the word ordered rather than told. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. Now that is remarkable. And I think it's perhaps very, very correct to say that he ordered them. Whatever king said, that's not just casual conversation. It would be an order, and he would have expected that order to be carried out. So he orders, and it's hard to imagine the hatred that was building on Saul relative to David, for him to have to tell his son as well as his attendants to kill David. But Jonathan, it continues here in verse 1, Jonathan take a great lightning to David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. So, again, we see, Jonathan is caught in the middle, and I liked on page 110, 107. It talks about this. Talks about how Jonathan was in the middle. He was. He's got his father, the king, on one hand. He's got his best friend, this very dear friend, and they are having conflict. Since they were having conflict, both of them had this relationship with Jonathan. He's caught in the middle. If he favors his father, he's going to go against his best friend. If he favors his friend, he's going against his father. So he's caught in the middle, there on page 107, it says it has been described by some as the hardest place to be. That is, caught in the middle between warring family members. It might be a husband and mother, it might be siblings, and for Jonathan here, how is he going to tell somebody in authority, his father the king, that they're wrong? And so he goes to him in a very dramatic way, and he tells him, he goes to David and tells him, stay out of the way, don't be getting involved. And it's interesting in verse 4, he goes to Saul and talks to him. Note that what he says there. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king do wrong. This kind of tells you the relationship between Jonathan, he's the son, but he refers to his father as the king instead of just calling him, saying, he refers to him as the king. Well, that sounds like everything's going to work out real well, but if you look in verse 5 to 7 of chapter 19, it doesn't work out real well. He says, Jonathan is talking, he says, he took his life, David took his life in his hand when he killed the Philistine, that is Goliath. The Lord won a great victory for all of Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Verse 6 through 8, we see the response of Saul. Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. Well, that doesn't last very long, but I think he's very genuine at that point. So Jonathan called David and told him that the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. Now, everything's all right. Verse 8, then once more war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them down with such force they fled before him. Verse 9, but an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul. So we see this cycle is that Saul, when he doesn't have this evil spirit, and we talked about that some last week, when that's not bothering, he has this wonderful relationship with David. But then as David has success, I think it's in himself. He keeps coming back to himself, and he get that jealousy and a type of relationship with David that can't be explained comes upon him, and he goes and wants to kill him. The rest in chapter 19, he continues. By this time, David is married to Michal, which is Saul's daughter, and she senses he's going to be killed, and you remember, she puts this kind of dummy to make it look like David's asleep, and David escapes out. And so this whole back and forth continues. Well, in chapters, we see that in chapter 20, chapter 21, David is escaping. He goes, he seeks refuge seeks to get refuge from the priest Ahimelech in Nob. And let me read chapter 21, verse 7 and 9. In verse 7 is that David is there speaking to Ahimelech. Now, one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeth, the Edomite, Saul's head shepherd. So he overhears what's going on with David and Ahimelech. David asks Ahimelech, don't you have a spear that I can use? If you recall, Ahimelech gives him the spear that belonged to Goliath. Then look in verse 9, it says, the priest provided the sword of Goliath, the Philistine whom you killed in the valley of Ehlad is here. It is wrapped in cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There's no sword here but that one. So David takes that, and he continues about his way. Chapter 22, Saul tries to, he comes and kills this priest, Ahimelech, for giving aid to Saul. Now, we finally get to our last section, chapter 23, and again, still Saul is pursuing David, and we get to verse 16. David is at Horesh, and while David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life, and Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in the Lord. That's a beautiful verse there. So Jonathan, even though he's been involved with this thing he's gotten involved in this relationship of David and Saul, even to the point that, I think I skipped over it, but I forget just which chapter it in, but anyway, Saul even tried to kill his son Jonathan. That's how much that conflict had occurred. Well, in verse 16, chapter 23, and Saul's son Jonathan went to David in Horesh and helped him find strength in the Lord. Don't be afraid, he said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. So this relationship, and this is, as I think I indicated before, this is the last time we have a record of David and Jonathan being together. I love this back in verse 16 that Jonathan helped him find strength in the Lord. That is, that's what we need as Christian brothers today, is that we help each other find strength. Sometimes we get beat down as we go through our Sunday school classes, as we go through church, then that strength is renewed by sometimes with other people helping us find that strength as we see them in their relationship today. In verse 17, Jonathan gives David some instruction. It says, first of all, it says, don't be afraid. He's saying that Saul would not lay a hand on David, which actually turned out to be true. He certainly continued to try to lay a hand on David, but then note what he continues to say in verse 17. He says that you will be king over Israel. Again, recall who this is. This is Jonathan, who is next in line to be king, but he recognized God's hand on David, and he said, you will be king on Israel, and I'll be your second in command. Well, we know that doesn't happen because Jonathan ends up being killed in battle, but he had that willingness to take a second role. And on page 110, the last paragraph says, although Jonathan would never get the opportunity to be David's number two, he was content to be in that supportive role. Serving in the shadow of someone else doesn't appeal to cultural emphasis of being top dog. Yet Jonathan was fulfilled in doing the will of God. He was at peace. Nothing can compare with the peace of being in God's will for your life. So we see this beautiful aspect, and finally they make another covenant. We don't know exactly what that covenant was. The details are not stated, but I envision it was a thing. Whatever you need, let me know, and that was both directions. That they would always support each other in whatever the future held. Well, this story has three significant points. First of all, the prevailing culture of Jonathan and David's day fully expected Jonathan to take that role as being the next king. Jonathan, therefore, had higher authority, but he willingly gave that up because of who David was. A second point is that Saul had harsh opinions about David and planned evil actions against him. And Jonathan, even though he had respect for his father, he spoke up against his father and refused to support those actions. it's sometimes very hard to, when you're in that type of situation, is to stand your ground. But it's expected of us to always stand for right. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, God had long been at work in preparing the way for David to be king, even though David looked like an unlikely candidate. And Jonathan ended up being a part of that plan of God. One of the questions in this book at the end asks is, have you ever handled a situation in which someone else received a promotion or praise for something that you desired? And that's, I think perhaps all of us had done that, has been in that situation where we see some people that have not been on job as long as you have get a promotion that perhaps you felt like you were deserving. Obviously, that's how Jonathan could have felt in this situation. He could have said, I'm the king's son. I deserve this. But yet, I think he, even though it hadn't been written at that time, he took the actions of Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good for them that love the Lord. And I think that he saw the presence of God in David, and he knew that it would all work for good if he supported him. And I think that's an important lesson for us today as we deal with perhaps siblings or co-workers, that sometimes things don't seem quite fair, but we know that God is at work in all things. With that, let me close. Next week we're going to be looking another very familiar. We'll go over in the book of Esther and look at again a bad relationship involving Haman. So we'll be looking at that next week. With that, let me close this prayer. I hope that you'll be able to join us for church on Sunday. Sorry, we're going to have a nice break and some beautiful weather, so it won't be quite as the heat won't be quite as difficult on us. So let me close this in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the blessings you give us. We thank you for just being with us. And Lord, help us in all of our relationships to recognize your presence. And whether that's a good relationship or bad, we know that you can work through that to make things work out good. Lord, be with us as we go through this week. We ask these things in your name. Amen.